The Lost Colony of Roanoke, America's first unsolved mystery. Welcome to Lost and Explained TV. Please subscribe if you like mysterious history. Now let's get to the story. In the late 1500s, more than 100 English settlers arrived on a small island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. They came hoping to build a new life, a permanent English colony in the New World. But when their governor returned from England 3 years later, the settlement was empty. The homes had been taken apart, the people were gone, and the only clue left behind was one strange word carved into a post: Croatoan. So what happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Did the settlers die? Did they join a Native American community? Were they attacked? Or did they simply disappear into history? Today on Lost and Explained TV, we're looking at one of America's oldest mysteries, the lost colony of Roanoke. Before Jamestown, before Plymouth, before the United States existed at all, England was trying to claim a place in the New World. Spain had already built a powerful empire across parts of the Americas. Spain had wealth, ships, colonies, and influence. England wanted its own foothold across the Atlantic. One of the men behind this dream was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was given permission by Queen Elizabeth I to explore and colonize lands in North America. The goal was not just settlement, it was also power. A colony could help England challenge Spain. It could become a base for trade, and it could give England a permanent presence in the Americas. The area chosen was along the coast of present-day North Carolina. At the time, the English called the region Virginia, named in honor of Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. This was a dangerous and uncertain plan. The settlers would be far from home. They would depend on supplies from England. They would have to survive unfamiliar land, weather, food shortages, disease, and complicated relationships with native peoples who already lived there. Still, England pushed forward. Roanoke was not England's first step into the New World, but it became one of its most famous failures. In 1585, an earlier English group arrived at Roanoke Island. This first colony was mostly made up of men. They built a settlement and tried to survive. But problems appeared quickly. Food was limited. Relations with nearby native communities became tense. The colonists depended heavily on local people for help, knowledge, and supplies. But mistrust grew on both sides. Eventually, the situation became too difficult. When the English sea captain Sir Francis Drake arrived nearby in 1586, many of the colonists chose to leave with him and return to England. That first colony failed. But the English were not done with Roanoke. They would try again, and the second attempt would become the mystery remembered today. In 1587, a new group of settlers sailed to the New World. This time, the plan was different. This was not supposed to be just a military outpost or temporary camp. It included men, women, and children. They were meant to build a permanent English settlement. The group was led by John White. White was an artist, explorer, and governor of the colony. He had visited the region before and had painted important images of the land and its native people. Among the settlers was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare. She was pregnant when she arrived. Soon after, she gave birth to a baby girl named Virginia Dare. Virginia Dare is often remembered as the first English child born in the Americas. For the settlers, her birth may have seemed like a hopeful sign. A new generation, a new beginning. But Roanoke was still a risky place to build a colony. The settlers arrived later than planned. Supplies were limited. And the relationship between the English and native communities was already complicated because of what had happened during the earlier colony. The new settlers needed help. They needed food. They needed peace with nearby groups. And they needed support from England. So John White made a difficult decision. He would return to England to gather supplies and bring them back. When he left, he expected to return soon. But history had other plans. John White sailed back to England in 1587. He left behind his daughter, his granddaughter, and more than 100 settlers depending on his return. But when he reached England, the country was preparing for war with Spain. In 1588, the Spanish Armada threatened England. Ships, sailors, supplies, and money were needed for defense. White could not simply sail back to Roanoke whenever he wanted. The conflict delayed him. Attempts to return failed. Years passed. Imagine what that must have felt like. For John White, every delay meant his family and colony was still across the ocean, waiting, running low on supplies, facing danger, or maybe already gone. It was not until 1590 that White finally returned to Roanoke Island, 3 years after he had left. What he found became one of the most famous mysteries in American history. When John White and the sailors arrived at Roanoke in 1590, they expected to find the colony, maybe struggling, maybe desperate, but still there. Instead, the settlement was empty. There were no settlers waiting, no sign of a busy colony, no clear evidence of a battle. The houses had been taken down. That detail matters. They were not simply burned or destroyed. They seemed to have been dismantled. This suggested the settlers may have left intentionally. Before White had gone to England, he and the colonists had agreed on a signal. If the settlers had to leave, they were supposed to carve the name of their destination into a tree or post. If they were forced to leave because of danger, they were supposed to carve a cross. White found one word carved into a post: Croatoan. He also found the letters CRO carved into a tree, but there was no cross. To White, this may have suggested that the colonists had not left under immediate attack. Croatoan was not a random word. It referred to the Croatoan people and to Croatoan Island, often associated with what is now Hatteras Island. That meant the missing settlers may have gone there, but White was not able to fully investigate. Bad weather and dangerous conditions forced the ships to leave. He never found his daughter. He never found Virginia Dare, and he never learned exactly what happened. For centuries, people have tried to explain the disappearance of Roanoke. There are several major theories. One theory is that the settlers tried to survive by joining nearby native communities. This may be the most realistic possibility. The colonists were low on supplies. They knew they might have to leave Roanoke, and the word Croatoan pointed toward a specific native community. If some settlers moved to Croatoan Island, they may have been accepted, married into local groups, or blended into native society over time. Another theory is that the colonies split apart. Maybe some went to Croatoan, others may have moved inland. The settlers may have separated into smaller groups to find food, safety, or better land. This would make them much harder to trace. A third theory is that they were killed. They may have been attacked by hostile groups, rival tribes, or even Spanish forces. But the lack of a distress cross and the dismantled buildings make a sudden violent attack less certain. Another possibility is starvation and disease. The settlers may have suffered from hunger, illness, or exposure. The colony depended heavily on supplies from England. When those supplies did not arrive for 3 years, survival would have become extremely difficult. There is also the environmental angle. Drought may have made life even harder. If crops failed and food became scarce, the colonists would have had fewer options. They may have had to abandon Roanoke just to stay alive. The mystery is not that there are no possible explanations. The mystery is that we cannot prove exactly which one happened. The word Croatoan is the most famous clue in the mystery. Some people treat it like something strange or supernatural, but historically it was probably a practical message. The settlers may have been saying, "We went to Croatoan." That would make the disappearance less like a ghost story and more like a survival story. The problem is that when John White returned, he did not get the chance to follow that clue properly. If he had been able to sail to Croatoan Island and search, the mystery might have been solved in 1590. Instead, the clue was left hanging. One word, no bodies, no colony, no final answer. And because of that, Roanoke became a legend. Part of why Roanoke is so mysterious is because the English records are limited. The colony was small, the location was remote, and by the time people returned, years had passed. Wooden buildings could disappear, people could move, communities could merge, memories could change. Later reports and stories claimed that some native people in the region had European features, used English words, or had connections to the lost colonists. But these claims are difficult to prove. Archaeologists and historians have searched for evidence. Some finds suggest possible English goods or contact in nearby areas. But nothing has fully solved the mystery. No single artifact has definitively answered what happened to all the settlers. And that is why Roanoke remains so powerful. It sits at the edge of history. There are clues, there are theories, but there is still no final ending. So what probably happened? The most likely answer is not that the settlers vanished into thin air, and it probably was not one simple event. The colonists were stranded for years. They were short on supplies. They were surrounded by native communities with their own politics, alliances, and conflicts. They knew help from England might not come, so they likely left Roanoke. Some may have gone to live with the Croatoan people. Others may have moved elsewhere. Some may have died from hunger, disease, conflict, or hardship. Over time, the survivors may have blended into nearby communities and disappeared from English records. In that version, Roanoke is not a supernatural disappearance. It is a story of survival, desperation, and lost documentation. But because John White never found them, because Virginia Dare's fate is unknown, and because the final clue was only one carved word, the mystery survived. The lost colony of Roanoke reminds us that history is not always neat. Sometimes the past leaves behind only fragments, a carved word, an empty settlement, a delayed rescue, a family that was never found. Roanoke was not the last English attempt to settle in America. Later colonies would succeed. But Roanoke became something different, a warning, a mystery, and one of the earliest unsolved stories in American history. So, what do you think? Did the settlers join the Croatoan people? Did they move inland? Or did something darker happen on Roanoke Island? Comment your theory below. And if you like mysterious history, lost places, and real stories that still leave questions behind, subscribe to Lost and Explained TV.